Welcome to Deduction Junction, where mysteries unfold and every detail holds a clue. Step into the brilliant mind of Hercule Poirot, the world's greatest detective, as we journey through his most intriguing cases. With logic sharper than a razor and an eye for the smallest detail, Poirot unravels crimes that leave others baffled. Get ready to immerse yourself in a world of suspense, deception, and of course, the little gray cells. The investigation begins now. Chapter 1. The Mask. Falls it was a night of decadence, of feathers and music, and the dull shimmer of candlelight caught on champagne flutes. Beneath the vaulted ceilings of Villa Moroni, just outside Venice, laughter echoed through frescoed corridors, while silk and velvet swept across the black marble floors like drifting clouds. Every guest wore a mask. It was the rule of the evening. Some were elaborate, porcelain faces with gold-painted smiles, plumed birds, devils, and angels. Others were simple, velvet dominoes with a subtle gleam, or the classic smooth white ovals of anonymity. The effect was dreamlike, theatrical, and unnerving. In such a place no face could be trusted at first glance, and every smile might conceal something darker beneath. It was nearly midnight when the first scream shattered the illusion. A woman, tall, commanding, her mask askew, had staggered into the ballroom from the east corridor, one hand outstretched, her pale gown soaked at the bodice with something that was most certainly not red wine. She collapsed beneath the grand chandelier, her hand opening to reveal a single white feather-stained crimson. Pandemonium broke out. Guests surged forward and recoiled in equal measure. A harpsichord player stopped mid-note. A waiter dropped a silver tray with a crash. "Call the police," someone shouted in Italian. "No, get a doctor." But even as her body was lifted and carried away, everyone already knew the truth. Elena. Ravelli was dead, and this was not an accident. The following morning, the villa stood hushed, its glamour dimmed. Sunlight filtered through gauzy curtains in the breakfast salon, catching in the silver coffee pots and untouched bowls of sugared fruit. Outside, the Grand Canal sparkled, indifferent to tragedy. Inside, grief hung like incense. Elena Ravelli had been no ordinary guest. She had been the hostess. Heiress to the Ravelli textile fortune, owner of the villa, and patron of the arts, her name was synonymous with elegance, influence, and in quieter circles, scandal. She was 47, widowed twice with no children, and a reputation for cultivating the most exclusive social gatherings in Europe. Her Venetian Masquerade had been intended as a capstone to the season, but instead it had become her final act. By 9 o'clock, the Italian police had arrived, efficient, brisk, and clearly overwhelmed. The mask had not concealed the fatal blow, a clean knife wound to the chest, just beneath the collarbone. No defensive wounds, no sign of a struggle. The murder weapon had not been found, and of course everyone had worn gloves. It was precisely the kind of case that made the police grumble and the press salivate. And it was precisely the kind of case that, by some stroke of fate or divine mischief, had unfolded in the presence of one Monsieur Hercule Poirot. Poirot had been seated at the far end of the banquet table when the scream came, politely enduring a rather tedious monologue from an Italian marquis who fancied himself a philosopher of modern etiquette. He had been sipping a modest glass of wine, nothing too bold, nothing to disrupt the order of digestion. Now, seated in the villa's private library with the shutters drawn and the scent of old parchment in the air, Poirot examined the facts with the same quiet intensity he had once reserved for stolen diamonds, international conspiracies, and the occasional ill-mannered countess. He was not disturbed by death. What disturbed him was the elegance of the murder. The calculation. The way the masked ball had provided not only concealment, but permission, as if the killer had simply extended the evening's theatricality one step further. A knock at the door. Poirot called softly, "Entrez." The butler, a tall Venetian with mournful eyes and polished shoes, stepped in and gave a respectful bow. Signorina Morelli wishes to speak with you, he said. She insists. She says Signora Ravelli would have trusted you. Poirot rose. Then let us oblige her. He found Lucia Morelli standing beneath a stained glass window in the gallery, her arms crossed, a dark silk shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders, though the day was warm. She was in her early 30s, sharp-featured, with a beauty that had something tragic about it. Eyes too old, lips too knowing. You were close to her? Poirot asked gently. I worked for her, Lucia said. I arranged her events, her schedule, her wardrobe sometimes. But yes, we were close. And you believe this was not random? She gave a short, bitter laugh. Random? Monsieur Poirot, she was many things, but never well loved. Admired, yes. Envied. Desired. But loved? Not by many. Poirot's eyes narrowed. Then we must consider. Who among those admirers wished her harm? Lucia stepped closer, voice low. You're not like the police. They ask who had opportunity, but you'll ask who had reason. He inclined his head. Just so, mademoiselle. The psychology, it reveals more than the footprint. Lucia reached into her handbag and pulled out something small, a folded, torn piece of parchment. She gave this to me 2 nights ago, she said. Told me to keep it safe. I don't know why, but I think it mattered. Poirot unfolded it, carefully. It was a guest list. Names he recognized. Some titled, some infamous. And beside one of them, underlined twice in red ink, was a single note in Elena Ravelli's elegant hand. Never trust the one behind the mask. Poirot stared at the name, his brow lifted by a fraction. Mon Dieu, he whispered, and he smiled. Chapter 2. The guests behind the masks. The silence in Villa Moroni had deepened. Not the hush of reverence or grief, but the tense, vibrating quiet of suspicion. The kind that grows in corners, behind half-closed doors, and in the pause between words. The kind of silence Poirot knew better than most. On the surface, the household remained elegant, composed. Meals were served at the usual hours. Staff moved about discreetly, lowering their eyes. The guests, those who had not already fled in well-bred panic, lingered, making careful remarks about delayed departures and waiting for clarity. But Poirot, ever attuned to the undercurrents of human emotion, sensed what simmered beneath. It was fear. Not fear of the police, perhaps, but fear of what the truth might reveal. He requested that the guests be gathered, not as suspects, he told them, but as persons of interest. A delicate phrase, more palatable to those of high breeding. He knew how to work within their pride. They assembled in the gold salon, a domed room at the heart of the villa, its walls adorned with faded 18th-century frescoes and the scent of antique roses lingering in the curtains. It was a space meant for whispered proposals, not accusations. Poirot stood before them with his hands clasped gently at his waist, observing each face in turn. There were 7 remaining guests. Each had been at the masquerade. Each had worn a mask. Each, Poirot believed, had something to hide. Lord Basil Ashcombe, an English nobleman with thinning silver hair and a complexion like old parchment. His cravat was tied with precision, and his cuffs gleamed with family crests. He had the unmistakable air of a man who believed the world owed him both obedience and discretion. He had been seen conversing with Elena in hushed tones before the dance began. His voice, Poirot noted, always carried the trace of a warning disguised as advice. Lady Francesca, Frankie, Bellamy. An American, impossibly blonde and garishly dressed in lilac and diamonds, Francesca was a widow of 3 years and spent most of her time between Monte Carlo and Portofino. She spoke in a brittle, sing-song voice and laughed too loudly at her own remarks. Her affection for Elena Ravelli had been public, flauntingly so, but those who listened carefully could detect the bitterness beneath the compliments. Count Alessandro Varese tall, olive-skinned, and devastatingly handsome, the Count moved with the lazy elegance of old money. His charm was unquestionable. So too was his reputation. Debts in Florence, women in Paris, and whispered involvement in dubious art dealings. He had known Eleanor since her first marriage, and their on-again, off-again entanglement was the worst-kept secret of Venetian society. Marguerite Duval, a former opera singer from France, now a quiet patron of the arts and close friend of the deceased. In her 60s, with graying hair and an expression carved from sorrow, she rarely spoke. But Poirot knew better than to mistake silence for irrelevance. She had once been the beneficiary of Elena's financial generosity, and perhaps more. Arturo Bellini, the villa's in-house curator, responsible for overseeing the Ravelli art collection. Short, soft-spoken, and always dressed in gray, Bellini was unassuming, but not forgettable. His presence in every corner of the masquerade had gone unnoticed until Poirot requested the guest list. He had not been invited. Dr. Sophia Moretti, the family physician. A poised woman in her 40s, with intelligent eyes and a spine like steel. She had been attending to Elena's health for over a year. Her reports had always been discreet, her comings and goings unremarkable. And yet, Poirot had already noted one curious inconsistency in her account of the night. Lucia Morelli, Elena's assistant, quiet, poised and fiercely loyal. Her presence was expected, her insight invaluable. Poirot had already spoken to her once, but there was more she had not said. Of that he was sure. Poirot spoke softly. Mesdames et messieurs, I thank you. I know the last day has been most distressing, but we must understand what has happened, not only for justice, but for peace, for Signora Ravelli's memory, and your own. He paced slowly before them. There are questions, yes, many. But before we ask the questions, let us understand the stage upon which this tragedy unfolded. He turned to face them. You were all at the masquerade. You all wore masks, and yet someone's mask slipped. No one spoke. Poirot continued. Let us begin not with accusations, but with the truth of appearances. Where were each of you precisely between 11:30 and midnight? You need not explain yourselves to me fully now, but understand. The details matter. The smallest contradiction may open a window. Lord Ashcombe was the first to respond, voice tight. I was in the garden, speaking with Lady Bellamy. She had taken ill from the heat. Lady Bellamy nodded. Quite true. He escorted me to the terrace. I couldn't breathe in that room, not with the perfumes and those damn masks. Poirot tilted his head. And you remained there until the scream? Yes, said Ashcombe. And no one else passed? They exchanged a glance. Lady Bellamy frowned. I don't believe so. But it was dark. The Count spoke next, his voice rich, theatrical. I danced with Eleanor shortly before she disappeared. I thought she had gone to change her mask. She was distracted. You were lovers once, Poirot said. The Count did not blink. Once, yes, but not recently. Yet your quarrel in the music room 3 nights ago was quite recent, Poirot replied calmly. The Count's jaw tightened. Marguerite Duval's voice cut in quietly. Eleanor had begun to doubt her decisions, about many things. She told me so. That night she seemed uncertain. Poirot turned to her. And where? Were you? I was in the antechamber beside the ballroom. I had a headache. I was sitting quietly. I heard someone run past, but I could not see who. Dr. Moretti spoke next. I had returned to my room to check on some medication. Elena had asked for something earlier in the evening. Her nerves had been troubling her. Poirot raised an eyebrow. And no one saw you? I doubt it, she said evenly. And you, Signor Bellini? The curator flushed. I was in the gallery. I was checking the placement of the Murano lamps. One had been knocked off center during the dancing. Convenient, murmured Lord Ashcombe. I wasn't hiding, Bellini said quickly. I wasn't even supposed to attend. Elena invited me at the last moment. She said I should witness what true elegance looked like before it vanished forever. And you, Mademoiselle Morelli? Poirot asked. Lucia hesitated. I went to look for her. Elena. She had disappeared from the ballroom without saying a word. That wasn't like her. I thought perhaps she had gone to the music room. You found her? No, she wasn't there. I checked the east corridor. That's when I heard the scream. Poirot nodded once. Merci. All of you. I ask now that you remain available. I shall speak with each of you, at length. You may return to your rooms, but I must ask that you do not leave the villa, not until the truth is unmasked. They dispersed. Slowly, warily, Poirot remained behind, still before the locketed doors of the gold salon. The sunlight struck the frescoes now, illuminating a painted mask on the ceiling, a laughing face with hollow eyes. He did not smile. It is always the same, he murmured. People lie to protect their dignity, their reputation, their secrets. But no mask, however beautiful, is impenetrable, and with that, Hercule Poirot turned on his heel and began his careful, deliberate pursuit of the truth, beginning not with what was seen, but with what was overlooked. Chapter 3. Poirot enters the game. The Venetian sun had grown strong by midday. Its light filtered through the silken drapes of Villa Maroni, falling in golden pools upon the cool marble floors. Though the air outside was warm and thick with the scent of wisteria, the interior of the villa remained quiet and unnaturally still. The guests had scattered to their corners, awaiting judgment, or perhaps rehearsing lies. Hercule Poirot sat in the study which had become his temporary base of operations. It was a richly appointed room, lined with tall bookcases and two clocks, one Swiss, one Italian, that ticked ever so slightly out of sync. A faint breeze from the open window stirred the fringe of the desk blotter, and the scent of beeswax. Polish lingered faintly in the air. The interviews were to begin, not with the loudest voices nor the most suspicious stories, but with the stillness. Poirot had always believed that silence often spoke loudest, and so it was that the first to arrive, summoned gently by the butler, was Marguerite Duval. She entered with her usual grace, though the sadness in her movements was unmistakable. She wore a dove-gray silk shawl, her eyes rimmed not with theatrical sorrow, but the weathered look of someone well acquainted with disappointment. Madame, Poirot greeted, standing. Merci for joining me. Please, sit. I believe this will be a conversation, not an interrogation. Marguerite gave him a tired smile and sat. You are kind, Monsieur Poirot, but I am old, and I have seen too much to fear questions. Poirot regarded her. You were close to Signora Ravelli. Ah, close. She shook her head. Yes and no. Elena trusted few, but she liked to be admired, and I admired her once. Perhaps that was enough. And in recent years, Marguerite's eyes drifted to the window. Things changed. We quarreled. She grew more secretive, more brittle, and I withdrew. I do not chase people, Monsieur Poirot, even those I once loved. Loved? Poirot repeated gently. She gave a soft chuckle. Not in the way you suggest, though I think Elena preferred love that was complicated. Poirot leaned forward slightly. You said yesterday that she seemed uncertain the night of the masquerade. What did you mean? She was restless. Her smiles were too wide, her glances too sharp. I know that look. It is the look of a woman preparing for confrontation. Confrontation. With whom? Marguerite hesitated. I do not know, but I heard her speaking to someone the afternoon before the ball. I was walking past the music room and heard voices, hers and a man's, angry, low. She ended it with, "Then you'd better be prepared for what comes." "You are certain it was Elena?" "Oh yes, I would know her voice in a storm." Poirot was quiet for a moment. "Merci, madame. That may prove most useful." Marguerite rose. "Be careful, Monsieur Poirot. You are dealing with people who have worn masks long before the party ever began." With that, she left the study. Poirot remained still for a moment, then jotted a brief note. Elena. Argument with male guest, music room, afternoon prior. Next, the butler brought in Lord Basil Ashcombe. Ashcombe entered with military efficiency, removing his gloves and seating himself without invitation. His posture was impeccable, his eyes cool and faintly condescending. "Monsieur Poirot," he said, "let's be clear. I am here because of the late Elena's request that you be included in this affair. I have no objection to that. But I expect these proceedings to be handled with tact." "Always," Poirot said mildly, "though truth often finds its own path, tactful or not." Ashcombe sniffed. "Very well. What would you ask?" "You escorted Lady Bellamy to the garden during the masquerade." "Yes, she was unwell. I saw her leave the ballroom and followed. I remained with her on the terrace until the scream was heard." "And during that time, did you observe anyone else enter or leave the villa?" "No one. The garden path is secluded and the view is narrow, but I would have heard footsteps." "Did you notice anyone behaving strangely in the hours prior?" Ashcombe paused. "I saw Count Varisi in the gallery, pacing like a tiger, and Elena was avoiding him quite obviously. She asked me earlier that day whether the Count's reputation had followed him from Florence. And what did you say?" "That reputations, like debts, are rarely left behind." Poirot raised an eyebrow. "Very poetic for a military man." Ashcombe gave a slight smile. One must read something in retirement. Poirot let the silence stretch. Then, with a slight incline of the head, he dismissed him. As the door shut, Poirot turned in his chair and made another note. Varisi, known confrontation. Elena sought reassurance. Ashcombe cautious, but observant. The third guest summoned was Arturo Bellini. The villa's curator entered with a nervous twitch to his movements, glancing around the study as though expecting the walls to close in on him. He wrung his hands, fingers spotted with ink and varnish. "Monsieur Poirot," he began at once, "I did nothing wrong. I wasn't even supposed to attend. She invited me at the last minute. I didn't bring a mask. I borrowed one from the props in the theater room." Poirot held up a hand. "Calm, calm. This is not the gallows. It is a conversation. You were in the gallery during the murder?" "Yes. Alone." "I was adjusting the lighting. I noticed one of the Murano sconces had been tilted. Elena hated asymmetry, as—" "Do I?" Poirot said dryly. "Tell me, did you hear anything unusual?" Bellini nodded. "I heard voices, raised ones, coming from the east corridor. Then footsteps, running. Male or female?" "I couldn't say. They were quick, light." "And when did you last see Elena alive?" "Just before the dancing began. She passed me in the hall. She looked angry. Her mask was off." Poirot's brow furrowed. "Off?" "Yes." She was carrying it in her hand. That, Poirot thought, was curious indeed. "Merci, Signor Bellini. You have been most helpful." When Bellini had gone, Poirot sat back and stared at the ceiling for several minutes, where a painted cherub peered cheekily from a rosette. Then softly he said, "The lady removed her mask before she died." "Why?" The answer, he knew, was key. It was well into the afternoon before Lucia Morelli arrived again, this time at Poirot's request. She looked drawn, but composed. "You searched for her," Poirot said. "Tell me precisely. Where did you look?" "First in the ballroom. Then the corridor. The garden door was open, but I didn't go out. I remember hearing someone in the small salon, perhaps humming." "Humming?" "Yes, a woman's voice. Just a few notes." And then? I was about to investigate. But then I heard the scream. I ran toward it instead. Poirot stood and crossed to the window. There are many doors in this villa, mademoiselle. Many exits, many entrances. But only one way to truth. He turned back to her. Did Elena confide in you? Truly. Lucia hesitated. She tried, but she was afraid. She kept saying, people think I'm the one in control, but I'm not. Not anymore. Poirot frowned. And did she say who had taken that control? No, but she did say one thing I found strange. Yes? She said, there's more than one kind of mask. Some we're born wearing. Poirot was silent. Then, very softly, he smiled. Merci, mademoiselle. I believe we are getting close. Chapter 4. The first false lead twilight settled over Venice like a silk shawl. Soft, intricate, and not without weight. From the balconies of Villa Moroni, the canals below shimmered with reflections of lantern light, casting long gold ribbons across the water. The villa's interior, however, remained shadowed, its chandeliers dimmed, its mirrors dark, as though unwilling to reflect what had taken place within its walls. In the study, Poirot sat in stillness, fingers steepled, as he considered the day's revelations. 7 guests, 7 masks, and now, one pointed whisper of guilt. Not because of what was said, but what was almost said. Lucia Morelli's remark lingered with, there's more than one kind of mask. Some we're born wearing. A philosophical sentiment? Perhaps, or perhaps a warning, carefully disguised. His thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. It was the butler, eyes lowered. Signor Bellini wishes to speak with you again, monsieur. Poirot gestured calmly. Show him in. Bellini entered moments later, hat in hand, face as pale as the marble floors. He looked like a man who had made a decision and deeply regretted it already. I have to tell you something, he said without preamble, voice low. I didn't tell you the whole truth earlier. About where I was. Poirot nodded for him to continue. I said I was in the gallery the whole time. That I was checking the sconces. But that's not entirely true. Poirot said nothing. I was in the gallery, Bellini said. But I left, briefly, around 11:45. I passed through the east corridor. I was going to fetch a catalogue from the study. I thought I could impress one of the guests by showing them the provenance of the Ravelli collection. Poirot arched an eyebrow. And did you see anyone? Bellini hesitated. Yes. I saw Count Varisi. Poirot's expression didn't change. He was standing just outside the study. He looked flustered. He had taken off his mask, and he was wiping his face with a handkerchief. I heard something crash inside the room. A small object, I think. And then he walked away, quickly. And you said nothing earlier? I was afraid. Varisi. He has powerful friends. Poirot folded his hands. And you? You have powerful fears. Bellini flushed. Poirot stood slowly, walking to the window. Signor Bellini, your omission is unfortunate, but the truth, even delayed, is always welcome. Merci. As Bellini left, Poirot turned back to his notebook. The timeline was tightening. 11:45. The scream had come at 11:53, the window between life and death. 8 minutes, and now Varisi stood at the center of it. Poirot requested the Count be summoned next. Count Alessandro Varisi arrived with a touch. Too much confidence, his black coat tailored within a millimeter of vanity, his dark hair slicked with care. His eyes were calm, but calculating, ever weighing the advantage of each word. Monsieur Poirot, he said, bowing slightly, we meet again. You are gracious to return. I find that discretion demands cooperation. A convenient motto, Poirot said. Tell me, Count, do you recall where you were shortly before midnight, on the night of the masquerade? I was in the salon, near the piano. Alone? No, with Lady Bellamy. We were discussing a mutual acquaintance from Florence. She can confirm. Poirot regarded him steadily. Signor Bellini recalls seeing you outside the study. Mask off. Appearing agitated. A pause. Varisi's eyes narrowed faintly. Bellini must be mistaken. Perhaps. Or perhaps not. Varisi's jaw tensed. Monsieur Poirot, I am not a man to be cornered by gossip. I left the ballroom. Briefly, yes, I needed air. I walked the corridor. I did not go into the study. Yet there was a crash, heard from inside. A servant, perhaps. Or you, Poirot said mildly, overturning something in haste. Varisi stepped forward. You wish to accuse me? Then do so directly. But I assure you, I am not a murderer. I do not accuse, Poirot said. I observe. Varisi gave a short bow and left, though his exit held a sharpness it had not before. Poirot waited. He knew the moment was close. The false lead was emerging, but the truth still waited beneath it. The next morning arrived shrouded. In mist, Poirot requested that Lady Bellamy join him for tea in the garden pavilion, where the fog swirled in quiet eddies among the box hedges. She arrived in a lavender shawl, face painted carefully, her perfume trailing behind her like memory. Lady Bellamy, Poirot said, you are a woman of remarkable candor. I value that. She arched an eyebrow. Flattery, monsieur. You surprise me. I surprise many, he said. Tell me, were you in fact with Count Varisi before midnight? A pause, then, no. Poirot inclined his head slightly. Merci. He asked me to say I was, said it would be a small favor, that he had gone out to smoke and it might seem improper. I don't like him, monsieur, but I dislike scandal more. And now? Now I dislike being used. Poirot smiled gently. As do we all. It was nearly noon when Lucia Morelli appeared unbidden at the study door. There's something else, she said. I wasn't sure if it mattered. Poirot gestured for her to sit. She pulled a small object from her pocket and placed it on the desk. It was a pearl button. I found it in the corridor, near the study, after the scream. I thought it had come from one of the costumes, but when I saw Dr. Moretti's gown this morning, I noticed the missing button. Poirot's eyes gleamed. Indeed? Yes. I asked her, but she said it must have been lost in the garden. Poirot lifted the button with delicate fingers and... In that moment he knew the false lead was complete. Varisi had been clumsy, evasive, but not dangerous. A liar, yes, but not a killer. The real deception lay elsewhere. And now, with this button, small, silent, forgotten, Poirot saw the true shape of the crime beginning to emerge. Chapter 5. The Psychological Game. There was a subtle art to pressure. Hercule Poirot often thought. To apply it too harshly was to crack the surface and frighten the truth away. But too gently, and the lie remained safely hidden, nestled behind pleasantries and polite evasions. The ideal, Poirot believed, was in precision, like tapping a porcelain vase in just the right spot to reveal the fracture lines invisible to the eye. And this, he mused as he adjusted his cuffs in the gilt-framed mirror of Villa Moroni's upper salon, was the perfect day for such precision. The discovery of the pearl button had shifted the course of the investigation, quietly but decisively. Count Varisi, once poised as the villain in the shadows, had revealed himself merely as a man caught in lies of pride, not murder. He had lied to preserve his image, not to conceal a blade. But the pearl button, small, elegant, functional, had fallen from Dr. Sophia Moretti's gown. And it had been found not in the garden, as she had claimed, but in the east corridor, near the very place where Elena Ravelli had been last seen alive. A coincidence? Poirot did not believe in such things. He believed in psychology. And so, late in the afternoon, Beneath the watchful gaze of painted ancestors and Venetian chandeliers, he summoned Dr. Moretti to join him for a private conversation. She entered, with quiet poise, clad in deep blue linen, her salt and pepper hair swept into a low knot. Her hands were tucked neatly into the pockets of her coat. A surgeon's hands, Poirot thought. Measured, intentional. "Dr. Moretti," he said warmly. "Merci for coming. I have been reflecting upon Signora Ravelli's final weeks. Her health, I believe, was in your care." "It was," she said, settling into the armchair opposite him. "Elena suffered from mild hypertension, some anxiety. Nothing particularly grave. No ailments of the heart. No, she was fit, physically. A bit frayed emotionally, perhaps, but who among us is not?" Poirot smiled slightly. "Indeed. And did she ever express fear?" Dr. Moretti tilted her head. "Fear. Fear of death. Or more specifically, fear of being killed." A pause. Then, "No," she said. "She could be dramatic, yes, but paranoid? No, she did not believe she was in danger." "Curious," Poirot said softly. "Because I have spoken to several of her guests who noticed that she seemed unsettled, uneasy." Dr. Moretti crossed one leg over the other. "That could mean many things. Elena had a gift for theatrical unease." "Ah," Poirot murmured. "But her death was not theatrical. It was silent, efficient, a single wound. No struggle." He rose and walked slowly to the window. A wound placed just beneath the collarbone. Not deep, but precise. Straight to the subclavian artery, enough to bleed her out in minutes. "That, madame, is not the work of panic or rage. It is knowledge. Medical knowledge." Behind him, silence stretched. When he turned, Dr. Moretti was watching him carefully. "You believe I killed her? I believe you were in the corridor where her body was found. That you lost a button there, and that you lied about it." Her lips pressed together. Poirot approached, slow and deliberate. "You see, madame, I believe Elena Ravelli did confide in you. I believe she told you something. Something you did not wish to hear. Something that threatened you." Dr. Moretti rose. "You are making dangerous implications, Monsieur Poirot. And you are deflecting." Poirot replied gently. "Why? Lie if there was nothing to hide?" She turned her face slightly away. "A woman in my position must be careful of scandal. I left the corridor, yes, I passed by the study. But I did not see Elena. I was simply returning from the pharmacy case in my room. I noticed the button was gone later that night." Poirot stepped closer. "You know as well as I do that one does not pass through that corridor without seeing the alcove, without hearing someone within it." Her eyes met his. "And what do you think I heard?" Poirot did not blink. "I think you heard a confrontation, perhaps even a threat, but I do not yet know from whom." There it was. A flicker. So brief it would be missed by most. A tightening at the corner of her mouth, a dilation of the pupils. Poirot knew that look. Recognition, memory, fear. But it was not the fear of guilt. It was the fear of knowing. He sat back, watching her carefully. "You are not the killer, Dr. Moretti," he said softly. "But you are close to them. Too close. And you know more than you have admitted." She was still for a long moment. Then, with an almost imperceptible sigh, she sat. "Elena was going to expose someone," she said at last. "She didn't say who, not exactly. But she told me that everything would change after the masquerade, that she had written something, left it somewhere safe. She called it her insurance." "A letter?" Poirot asked. "No, I think it was a document. She said it would strip away the masks for good." That was her phrase. Poirot leaned forward, his voice quiet but sharp. "Do you know where she hid it?" "No. But I know who she told last. Lucia Morelli." Poirot's eyes narrowed. She confided in Lucia. She trusted her more than anyone, Dr. Moretti said. More than she should have. Poirot rose once more. Merci, madame. That will be all, for now. As she left, Poirot stood still for a moment, letting the weight of her words settle. Lucia, again. Always on the periphery, always calm, always watching, and now, perhaps, in possession of something far more dangerous than a secret. Proof that... Evening, Poirot took a solitary walk through the east corridor. The villa was quieter now, its inhabitants drifting through the final days of their stay with increasingly brittle civility. The corridor was narrow, the sconces casting long shadows. It ended in a small reading room, rarely used. Inside, the air smelled of old paper and bergamot oil. Poirot ran his hand along the edges of a shelf, his fingers trailing delicately. Then, beneath a heavy Italian folio bound in red leather, he found something. A thin envelope, unmarked. Inside, a folded document, typed, crisp. He unfolded it slowly. It was a legal contract, a transfer of ownership, a statement of inheritance. Elena Ravelli had been preparing to transfer a portion of her estate, quietly, legally, to Lucia Morelli. And the date? The morning after the masquerade. Poirot stared at the signature. Elena had written, "In acknowledgement of a loyalty that neither blood nor money can claim." So, there it was. Not just a motive, but a trigger. And now Poirot knew precisely which mask had cracked, and which face lay beneath. Chapter 6. Another revelation the next morning. Venice awoke beneath a veil of mist. From the balconies of Villa Moroni, the city's famed canals looked like lengths of polished slate, silent and smooth beneath a pewter sky. Gondolas drifted like ghosts between marble bridges, and in the distance the bells of San Giorgio rang a low, melancholic chime. Inside the villa, however, there was movement, tension, whispers. For although the guests still played at civility, shared polite meals in the marble dining hall and nodded curtly in the corridors, an unease had begun to thread its way through the house. The sense that one of them was not what they seemed, that the mask was not only symbolic, but real and deadly. Hercule Poirot, after a modest breakfast of soft eggs and 2 precisely cut slices of toast, returned to the study with purpose. The envelope he had found the night before, Elena Ravelli's unsigned document bequeathing part of her estate to Lucia Morelli, rested inside a leather portfolio at his side. He had not yet shared it with anyone. Not yet. Not until he understood why it had been hidden, and more importantly, why Elena had not lived to deliver it herself. His instincts now pointed in one direction, toward Lucia. But Poirot, for all his clarity of thought, knew that instinct must be tested. And so he would test it, not with accusation, but with opportunity. The subtle pressure, the precision of psychology. Before that, however, there was someone else he wished to see, someone who, until now, had played the game with perfect elegance. Lady. Francesca Bellamy received him in the music salon, seated beside a grand harpsichord, and sipping from a china cup of something vaguely herbal. She wore a lemon-yellow dressing gown and large sunglasses, though they could not fully conceal the bags beneath her eyes. "Do sit down, Monsieur Poirot," she said, gesturing with a tired hand. "I assume we are past the phase of polite interviews and have entered the territory of quiet insinuations." "I do not insinuate," Poirot replied mildly. "I only ask questions that do not yet have their answers." She chuckled. "Isn't that the same thing, with a better manicure?" Poirot folded his hands. "Lady Bellamy, you were among the last to speak with Elena before the masquerade began." Her smile faded slightly. "Yes." "And you argued?" "It was a conversation," she said slowly. "A private one. She told you of her intentions to alter her estate." The sunglasses came off. Her eyes, green and sharp, locked with his. "She mentioned something," Francesca said. She said she was tired of pretending, that it was time to reward loyalty, not lineage. I didn't know she meant Lucia. Poirot raised a brow. But you suspected. I suspected it wasn't going to be me, she said dryly. Elena never gave gifts without strings, and I had stopped playing her games. Were you angry? Furious, she said flatly. I'd supported her when no one else did, during her second husband's scandal. During the liquidation of the Milan house, I lent her my name when hers was starting to sour. And in return, she scoffed. A mask, a drink, and a polite little threat. A threat? She said, you'd be surprised what people remember when their money's in danger. Poirot's eyes narrowed. And what would she remember? Lady Bellamy didn't answer. Instead, she set down her tea and crossed her legs. Are you here to accuse me? No, madame. I am here because you, like many in this house, were not afraid of Elena. But you were afraid of what she might reveal. There was a long silence. She never knew how to let things go, Lady Bellamy said at last. She could forgive anything but irrelevance, and I think in the end, that's what she feared the most. Poirot inclined his head. Merci. As he left, he added one more line to his mental list. Motives are rooted in what people fear they'll lose, not in what they hope to gain. That afternoon, Poirot requested a private walk in the gardens with Lucia Morelli. She hesitated at first. Her posture was as neat as ever, her dark hair pinned with faultless precision, but her eyes were wary now, flicking toward the windows, the statues, as if seeing them in new light. They walked slowly along the hedge-lined paths, the scent of old roses heavy in the still air. You knew, Poirot said at last. You knew she was changing the will. Lucia didn't respond. Poirot went on. You were loyal to her, devoted, but you also knew that your position in this house was precarious. Without her protection, you would have been cast aside. Still, no response. I found the document, he said. The legal transfer. Elena had signed the first page. The second was blank, but her intent was clear. Lucia stopped walking. Where did you find it? In the reading room, he said. Beneath, a folio, hidden but not burned. Why? Lucia looked at him then, and for the first time, her calm cracked, just slightly. Because I couldn't destroy it, she said. Not after what happened. After she died? Lucia nodded. Poirot's voice softened. You found her? Lucia swallowed. No. I found her after. I heard the scream, like everyone else. But I found her lying there. Before the staff. Before the guests. I knew she was dead. And the document? It was in her hand, Lucia whispered. She must have been going to deliver it to someone, or maybe hide it. I panicked. I took it. Poirot was silent for a long moment. Why hide it? He asked. Because I didn't want them to think I had killed her for it. And now? He asked. She looked up, and for the first time, Poirot saw fear, true, raw, unfiltered. Now I don't know what to think, she said. But I didn't kill her, I swear to you. Poirot looked at her a moment longer, then nodded. I believe you, he said. But the person who did, they believe no one knows. They began walking again. But someone does know, Poirot said softly. Someone heard a conversation, saw a movement, noticed a change. Lucia turned to him. Then what do we do? Poirot smiled faintly. We wait, just a little longer. The masks are slipping. That evening, as the villa dined in hollow elegance once again, Poirot watched. He watched Lady Bellamy as she picked at her risotto, Lord Ashcombe as he ignored the wine list, Bellini as he spilled salt and flushed like a guilty child. Dr. Moretti, silent. The Count, scowling, and Lucia, still and quiet at the end of the table as though removed from it all. But Poirot had made his decision. He would gather them soon. He had all he needed but one thing: timing, and timing, like justice, was most powerful. When it came just after the silence. Chapter 7. The Man Behind the Mirror. The villa was quieter that night than it had been since the masquerade. Not still, not peaceful, but subdued, like the hush before a storm, when even the trees seemed to brace themselves. Somewhere in the east wing, a clock chimed 10. It was the only sound beyond the distant lapping of the Grand Canal against the marble piers. Poirot stood at the threshold of the small salon, a room rarely used, its mirrored walls designed for daylight reflection. At night, the space felt cavernous, doubles of oneself cast endlessly into the dark. He stepped inside, shoes making no sound on the inlaid floor. He looked into one of the mirrors. It showed a man alone, yes, but not aimless. Every moment had been deliberate. Every question, every pause, each invitation to tea or walk in the garden had built a web, and now the spider waited. The final strand, he knew, would come not from what people had said, but from what they hadn't, from what had been deliberately avoided. He returned to the study where Lucia had left him earlier. The envelope lay beside his notebook. He did not open it again. There was no need. The document was a key, but not to a fortune, to motive. He made a note with his fountain pen. Final interviews. Push the boundaries. Observe not what they claim, but what they dodge. And then he rang the bell for the butler. Please ask Count Verisi and Dr. Moretti to meet me in the east corridor. In 20 minutes. The butler's brows lifted faintly, but he bowed. Of course, monsieur. Poirot walked slowly to the east corridor himself. The lights were low, the space narrow. To most, just another passage between rooms. But to Poirot, it was the stage, the scene of the crime, a place of transition, not just physically, but morally. When Verisi arrived, he looked irritated. Moretti, reserved but curious. Why here? The Count asked, glancing around. Poirot smiled faintly. Because this is where it began, and where it ended. Would you indulge me in a small reenactment? Moretti crossed her arms. This is theatrical. All murder is theatrical, Doctor, Poirot said. Whether the actors admit it or not, he gestured to a point on the carpet. Elena Ravelli was found here, just beneath the sconce. Verisi nodded, arms folded. So, you were here, Count Verisi, Poirot said, turning to him. You left the ballroom. You were agitated. Bellini saw you. I've already said as much. Did you know Elena intended to alter her will? Poirot asked quietly. The Count flinched. No. Of course not. Poirot did not respond. Moretti's eyes narrowed. You suspect him again? Poirot turned to her. No, I do not. But I suspect both of you heard more than you claim. On the night of the masquerade, in this corridor, Verisi glanced toward the door. If this is some kind of trap, No, Poirot said. Not a trap, but perhaps a reminder. He stepped between them and tapped the base of the sconce. There was a faint sound, a click. A panel opened. Behind it, a small recess. Empty. Verisi stared. That was there the whole time? Poirot nodded. Hidden in plain sight. Elena kept secrets, but not from everyone. He looked to Dr. Moretti. You saw her come here, didn't you? Before the scream. You heard her speaking with someone. Moretti said nothing. Poirot stepped forward. Not a man. A woman. Still nothing. a woman who had everything to lose if Elena's secrets came to light. Moretti exhaled slowly. I heard voices, yes, but I couldn't make out words, and I didn't want to interfere. I thought it was a lover's quarrel. I left. Poirot gave a small nod. He believed her. That left one piece missing, the final witness, as a... The others left. Poirot made one final request of the butler. Bring Lord Ashcombe to the North Library. In 30 minutes, alone. Poirot waited, watching the fire flicker in the small grate. The North Library was colder than the rest of the house. The windows, tall and narrow, looked out over a private portion of the canal. It had once been the retreat of Elena's first husband, a man who drowned under mysterious circumstances during a stormy night almost 20 years ago. When Ashcombe arrived, he was impeccably dressed as always, monogrammed cufflinks, a pocket square folded like origami. Monsieur Poirot, he said, nodding. You wish to speak? Poirot offered him a chair. A final question, Lord Ashcombe. One I have saved until now. You told me you were with Lady Bellamy during the scream. Yes. And she corroborated your story. Ashcombe's eyes narrowed. You imply collusion? No, I imply calculation. Poirot folded his hands. I believe you are an honest man, a proud one. But I also believe you are a man who recognizes when silence serves better than truth. Ashcombe said nothing. Poirot continued. You knew Elena for years. You were one of the few guests she invited repeatedly. She valued discretion. Indeed. As do you, but that is not what saved you from her wrath. It was loyalty. Elena knew your secrets, and you knew hers. Ashcombe's face remained blank, but the hands gripped the arms of the chair. Poirot rose. She told you she was afraid. She confided in you that someone was manipulating her, threatening to expose something, perhaps from her past. I believe she asked for your help, perhaps even protection. Ashcombe looked away, toward the canal. She was terrified, he said finally. Not for her life, but for her legacy. She said everything she built would be ruined, that her name would be dragged through mud. She said she wanted to unmask someone, but not if it meant losing everything. Poirot's eyes lit with understanding. She hesitated. Yes, Ashcombe said. She was wavering. She wanted to release the document, and she didn't. She told me, if I go through with this, I lose everything I spent a lifetime pretending to be. He paused. I advised caution. And what did she decide? Poirot asked. I don't know, Ashcombe said. That was the last time I saw her. She seemed resolved, but she also seemed tired. Poirot sat slowly. Then, almost to himself, he said, so she was not killed to prevent a revelation. She was killed because she changed her mind. Someone feared she might not go through with it after all, that her silence could return. He looked up. And silence can be deadly. Ashcombe stood. You have your answer, then? Poirot nodded. Not yet, but I have the final piece. Now I must place it. As Ashcombe left, Poirot remained in the library, watching the faint ripple of water beyond the glass. He was close. The picture was forming. It was not a crime of passion, nor a crime of greed alone. It was a crime of timing, of psychology, of the fear that comes not from exposure, but from irrelevance. And tomorrow, the curtain would rise on the final act. The masks would fall for good. Chapter 8. Whispers and warnings dawn. Broke in hesitant streaks over the Venetian skyline, veiling the city in a pale lavender mist. The Grand Canal stirred with the first movements of gondoliers, their oars gliding silently through the water like memories fading in and out of light. At Villa Moroni, the morning arrived not with a bang, but with the rustle of silk, the slow clink of porcelain, the guarded exchange of glances over breakfast. No one spoke of the investigation, not directly, but the air was thick with knowledge, or worse, assumption. Lucia Morelli, pale but composed, took her usual place at the side of the breakfast room, her presence unobtrusive. Dr. Moretti passed her once, offering a neutral nod. Francesca Bellamy pretended not to notice either woman. Count Varisi sipped his coffee with exaggerated indifference. Arturo Bellini barely touched his food. Lord Ashcombe, the only one who seemed unaffected, read from a folded copy of The Times, though his eyes didn't move with the lines. Poirot was last to arrive. He greeted no one, simply poured himself a modest cup of black coffee, took a slice of dry toast, and sat near the window. For nearly 20 minutes he said nothing. It was Lady Bellamy who broke the silence. "Charming weather for a reckoning," she murmured, lifting her espresso cup. Poirot smiled faintly. "Indeed, madame, though I fear the sky may yet turn." Eyes turned toward him now, subtly but surely. He waited one breath longer, then said with casual finality, "This afternoon, I shall be calling a meeting, in the Gold Salon, at 4 o'clock sharp. I believe we will all benefit from clarity." There was no reaction, just a silence that deepened. And in that silence the ripple of dread began again. Poirot left the breakfast table without further remark. He did not need to say more. The seed had been planted. Let them wonder. Let them doubt. Let them begin to turn on each other. He walked the grounds once more, this time alone. The garden was dewy and overgrown, the statues of goddesses and muses, worn soft by centuries of rain and salt. He paused beneath a crumbling archway overgrown with ivy, then turned toward the villa again, his gaze lifting to the upper windows. Someone was watching him. He felt it. Not paranoia, just instinct. He had learned long ago that guilt makes people curious. It draws them to the man who knows, makes them circle him like moths to flame, knowing full well they might burn. When he returned inside, Lucia was waiting in the corridor. Her eyes were wide, uncertain. "You're calling them all together?" "Yes," Poirot said gently. "Will?" "You name the killer?" "None," he said. "Not yet, but the web is nearly complete." She hesitated. I think I need to tell you something else." Poirot waited. Lucia looked over her shoulder, then stepped closer. "There was another note," she whispered. "Not the guest list. A second one. Elena left it in her journal. I found it after she died." Poirot raised an eyebrow. "You did not mention this before. I wasn't sure it mattered. But now—" She handed him a small folded page. Faint writing, in Elena's tight, slanted hand. "The past is not past. It is always present. It waits behind glass, behind the smiles. And when I say it, when I say what I know, one of them will try to silence me. I only hope it is quick." Poirot read it twice, then carefully folded it again. "I think she knew," Lucia whispered. "That it was coming." Poirot nodded. She knew the killer would not wait for the curtain to rise. At midday, Poirot took a private moment in the music salon. He sat before the grand piano, fingers resting lightly on the keys without pressing them. The room was filled with silence, not the absence of sound, but a different kind of quiet, expectant, tense. He had one more conversation to conduct before the final gathering, and it was not with a suspect. It was with the past. He asked the butler to retrieve Elena's personal valet, a quiet man named Vittorio, who had remained mostly invisible since the night of the masquerade. Vittorio entered humbly, his hands folded, his shoes scuffed in a way the guests never were. "Monsieur Poirot," he said, bowing, "you served Signora Ravelli long." "Since her second marriage, sir, 17 years. You were loyal to her?" "With my life," he said simply. Poirot studied him. "You know who she feared?" Vittorio didn't flinch. "I think she feared regret, monsieur. She never said it aloud, but I could see it." There was a sadness in her the last few weeks. She kept saying, "I built a palace out of glass, and now I must pretend not to see the cracks." Poirot nodded. Did she ever speak of Venice, of her youth? Vittorio hesitated. Only once, the day before the masquerade. She stood in the gallery and looked at the portrait of her father. She said, "He would have understood. He knew what it meant to live in a lie that no one could name." Poirot frowned. That he had not heard before. He stood, pacing slowly toward the grand oil painting in the salon's archway. A stern man. "In dark robes, the Ravelli patriarch. Merci, Vittorio," he said softly. "You have helped me more than you know." 4 o'clock came with all the solemnity of a funeral. The gold salon had been arranged anew. Chairs placed in a semicircle, a low table in the center bearing only a silver tray of untouched glasses. The guests entered one by one, each carefully dressed, each bearing the faintest mark of unease. Lady Bellamy wore violet again, but with less flair. Count Verisi had replaced his cravat with an open collar. Ashcombe's shoes shone too brightly, an old soldier's attempt at control. Lucia, in black, was the last to enter. Poirot remained standing. He looked at each of them, in turn. Then he spoke. "Mesdames et messieurs, we are nearing the end." A pause. "Not merely the end of our stay at Villa Maroni, but the end of something more elaborate, the end of the performance." He clasped his hands. "You see, this masquerade was not just an event. It was an echo, a reflection of something that had already been happening. Each of you has worn a mask, some literal, others figurative. And Elena Ravelli, she saw through them all." He turned. She was planning to reveal something, not a secret of hers, but of someone else's, someone whose identity, history, or intentions could not survive the light of day. Count Verisi stiffened. Poirot ignored it. She feared that by speaking she would lose everything. And so she hesitated. But someone else feared she might change her mind. And so they did not. Poirot let the silence deepen. Then he walked slowly to the center of the room. In her final hours, Elena left behind 2 things. One was a legal document, hidden in a reading room, transferring part of her estate to Lucia Morelli. There was a murmur. Poirot raised a hand. And the second was a note, a warning, that someone might kill to protect what was already a lie. He turned to face them fully. This, my friends, was never about fortune, nor love, nor revenge. His voice dropped to a near whisper. It was about survival. He let that word settle, let it echo into each of them. Then he bowed slightly. "Tomorrow I will reveal what I know. Tonight I ask you to reflect. Consider not what you saw, but what you chose not to see." He left them then, not with a dramatic accusation, but with silence. A silence so loud it rang through every corridor. Because now, they all knew. Someone had survived by becoming someone else, and Hercule Poirot had seen the cracks in the mask. He simply hadn't said which one. Not yet. Chapter 9. The mask slips that night. The villa did not sleep. Not truly. Rooms remained lit long past midnight. Shadows moved behind shutters. Footsteps echoed faintly down marble halls. Even the staff, usually invisible, moved with hesitation, aware that something had shifted, that a decision had been made, if not yet spoken aloud. Lucia Morelli sat in her room, the document folded once more in her hands. She had read it a dozen times. It no longer surprised her. What surprised her was that she still felt afraid. Down the corridor, Arturo Bellini paced his narrow quarters, eyes darting to the closet door, where a velvet mask, borrowed, forgotten, damning, hung from a coat hook like a relic from a dream gone wrong. Dr. Moretti stood at her vanity, brushing her hair in slow, mechanical strokes, her eyes fixed not on the reflection of her face, but the shadows behind it. Lady Bellamy took a final sip of brandy and whispered something to a locked drawer. And in the gallery, between two faded portraits, Count Verisi stood alone, gazing out the tall windows into the darkness beyond the canal. It was Lord Ashcombe, perhaps, who slept best, but even his dreams, if they came at all, must have been tinged with memory, because, now, they all knew one thing. The performance was nearly over. Poirot did not sleep either. He sat once more in the small salon of mirrors, the only light a single candelabra on a side table. The rest of the room remained in darkness, except for the reflections, dozens of him in every direction. Some tilted, some warped, others eerily exact. He was not reflecting on the facts. Those he had long since ordered. He was reflecting on the people, on how easily they had accepted their roles, how willingly they had donned their masks, both literal and otherwise. Some had done so to protect themselves, others to protect lies. But one had done so for something deeper, something colder, to erase who they had once been. That, Poirot had come to understand, was the true motive, not murder, but reinvention, and murder had simply become the price. The next morning brought grey, skies and a faint drizzle, fine as silk threads. The villa seemed suspended in time, the mist blurring its outlines as though it might vanish into the lagoon altogether. Poirot breakfasted early, alone, and left word that he would be unavailable. Until noon, he walked the upper levels of the house, pausing occasionally to study a painting or examine a piece of statuary. Not as a detective, but as a visitor, truly seeing Villa Moroni for the first time without distraction. In the east corridor, he ran his hand along the now closed wall recess. In the music room, he stood silently before the grand piano, pressing a single key, C-sharp. The note rang out, lonely, and faded quickly into silence. In Elena Ravelli's private dressing room, now sealed by police, he gazed briefly at the mirrored armoire and the half-packed trunk near the bed. She had been preparing to leave. Not the villa, perhaps, but something else, a life, a truth, a lie she could no longer carry. At precisely 11:30, Poirot stepped into the library, where Lucia was already waiting. She rose at once. "You said you wanted to see me again." Poirot nodded. "Oui, just one more thing, mademoiselle. It is about the night of the masquerade." Lucia's expression tightened. "You told me you went looking for Elena." "Yes." "You passed through the east corridor. You heard humming." She nodded slowly. "I thought someone was in the small salon." "But you did not look." "No." Poirot stepped closer. "You see, mademoiselle, I believe that was the moment the killer struck. And I believe they did so knowing you were near." Lucia's breath caught. "That doesn't make sense. Why wouldn't they wait?" "Because," Poirot said softly, "they needed an alibi. And your proximity provided one. You heard the scream. Shortly after, did you not?" She nodded. Poirot's voice dropped further. "And you were the first to reach her body." Lucia's eyes widened. "You think—" "I think someone counted on you being nearby. Someone who knew your patterns, your instincts. Someone who understood you would act quickly and appear trustworthy." He paused. "I also think you recognized something in that moment. Something you have not yet told me." Lucia stared at him. "I saw her mask," she said finally. It had fallen beside her. But there was another mask, half buried in the curtain. It wasn't hers. I thought perhaps it had been left there by someone earlier, a party guest. Poirot said nothing. Lucia hesitated. It was cracked, along the edge, and there was a small smear of red, lipstick maybe. I didn't pick it up. I didn't want to contaminate anything. Poirot nodded slowly. "You did not contaminate the scene, mademoiselle, but someone else did." Shortly after noon, Poirot sought out the butler. "Would you be so kind," he said, "as to bring me the trunk stored in the theatre dressing room?" The butler looked momentarily puzzled. "The costumes, monsieur?" "Just one. The trunk with the velvet masks." 20 minutes later, Poirot stood alone in the small rehearsal room near the villa's rear wing. The trunk had been brought and opened on a low table. Inside, nestled in rich purple lining, were the discarded masks of the masquerade, extras, borrowed last minute, or swapped during the night's revelry. Poirot examined each one carefully, turning them over, inspecting the seams. Near the bottom of the pile, he found it. A white velvet mask, its edge cracked, faintly stained with something. Dark near the temple, blood or lipstick. He did not touch it. Instead, he retrieved a pair of gloves from his coat and lifted it delicately into the light. Then he checked the inside. Faint, nearly invisible, but there, a single stitched initial, nearly rubbed away. F.B. Poirot smiled without mirth. By mid-afternoon, the tension in the villa had reached its apex. The rain had deepened into a steady curtain. Guests lingered restlessly in their rooms, waiting for the inevitable call. Lady Bellamy sat in her dressing chair, applying a second coat of powder to a face already too pale. Dr. Moretti prepared tea, but left it untouched. Count Varisi smoked 2 cigarettes in rapid succession, breaking his usual languid rhythm, even. Bellini had ceased rearranging the art catalogues. At precisely 4 o'clock, Poirot entered the gold salon once more, but this time he did not summon the guests. Not yet. He stood before the frescoed wall, alone, letting the moment bloom slowly. The time for games was nearly over. The masks had cracked, and soon, very soon, they would shatter. Chapter 10. The Pressure. Bill's rain fell like a slow metronome on the windows of Villa Moroni, soft, insistent, never quite letting up. The canals beyond were veiled in mist, the water dark and still, as though the city itself were holding its breath. Inside the villa, the air felt heavier than it had all week. The guests had not been formally summoned, yet by 4:30, they had gathered, one by one, drawn by instinct or fear, or simply the inevitability of what Hercule Poirot would do next. They seated themselves cautiously in the gold salon, where everything from the carved cherubs to the antique sconces seemed to lean forward in anticipation. Poirot arrived last. He entered not with drama, but with precision. His gray suit was pressed, his mustache immaculate. Under one arm, he carried a thin leather folder. In his opposite hand, the white velvet mask. The room watched him without a word. He placed the folder on the center table, then set the mask atop it. Lady Bellamy's eyes flicked to it, and quickly away. Poirot did not begin with a speech. Instead, he turned to the window, hands clasped behind his back, and let the silence stretch like taut wire. Only when it became unbearable did he speak. "There is a moment," he said softly, "in every performance, when the audience leans forward, when the actors hesitate, when the illusion, no matter how perfect, begins to falter." He turned slowly. "That moment has come. No one moved." Poirot stepped forward. "For the past 3 days, we have spoken of masks, of motives, of movements between rooms, but we have not spoken of fear, not truly. And it is fear, mes amis, that has guided every step of this tragedy." He gestured to the mask. "This was found in the costume trunk. It is stained. It is cracked. It bears the initials F.B., stitched beneath the lining, nearly rubbed away. Lady Francesca Bellamy, do you recognize it?" All eyes turned. Lady Bellamy's face remained composed. Her voice was dry. "I had several masks that night. Eleanor lent them to me. I don't recall every stitch of velvet." Poirot inclined his head. "Just so. A reasonable answer, but unfortunately not an honest one." He picked up the mask. This was not among the guest-distributed costumes. It belonged to you. And it was found, tucked beneath a curtain in the corridor, mere feet from where Eleanor Ravelli's body was discovered. A flicker crossed her face. Too faint for most. Not for Poirot. He placed the mask back on the table. I do not accuse you, madam. Not yet. But I ask you this. Why was it removed? Why was it hidden? If you were not in that corridor, if you were with Lord Ashcombe as you claimed, how did your mask come to be discarded so near the scene of the crime? Lady Bellamy did not answer, but Lord Ashcombe did. I believe, he said stiffly, that perhaps Lady Bellamy was not with me the entire time. A murmur rippled through the room. Francesca turned toward him, eyes flashing. You're changing your story now? I am correcting it, Ashcombe said. I escorted you to the terrace, but you left me there. I remained. Alone. Poirot gave a slight nod. Merci, Lord Ashcombe. Honesty, even late, is welcome. He turned back to Francesca. I think you left the ballroom in pursuit of Elena. I believe you followed her. Perhaps to speak, perhaps to threaten. You quarreled, yes? She lifted her chin. We exchanged words, that is all. What words? She said she was done playing games, that she no longer needed to please anyone, that from now on she would reward those who mattered, not those who demanded. Lady Bellamy's voice shook slightly. She said, You've had your time. You're not owed more. And how did you respond? Poirot asked quietly. I told her she was selfish, Francesca said. That she liked to destroy what she couldn't control. That she never cared for loyalty, only for power. Her voice cracked. She laughed. That was the last thing she did. She laughed. The silence that followed was sharp. Poirot let it settle. Then he spoke, gently. Madame, you are not a killer, but you are a woman whose pride has long masked disappointment. And in that moment, I believe you let anger speak. You removed your mask to make yourself known. And when Elena fell, when she collapsed, you panicked. You fled. You hid the mask. He took a step closer. But Elena was not dead yet. Lady Bellamy's gaze snapped to his. Poirot's voice dropped to a murmur. She was bleeding, yes. But not gone. It took several minutes. Long enough for someone else, someone watching, to step forward. He turned. Someone who had waited, not with a weapon, but with a decision. Bellini shifted nervously. Dr. Moretti folded her hands. Tighter. Poirot walked slowly along the line of guests. Elena Ravelli had been preparing a statement, a legal transfer. She intended to change her estate. That much we know, but the document was unsigned. She wavered. She delayed. He turned. To Lucia. She trusted you. Lucia's voice was quiet. She did. And she gave you a guest list, a warning, but she never gave you the full truth. Lucia hesitated. No, she admitted. She said it was safer that way. Poirot's eyes narrowed. She meant that literally. That if you knew, you would be in danger. Lucia looked at him, startled. She was trying to protect you, but in doing so, she made herself a target. Poirot walked to the fire. I have seen this before, he said. Not in Venice, but in Paris, in Cairo, in Istanbul. A crime of image, of identity, when the killer is not trying to silence a truth, but to preserve a lie. He turned. Elena Ravelli had known something. Something about one of you. A past. A falsehood. She had considered exposing it, and then, perhaps in mercy or exhaustion, she decided not to. He looked down, and that is why she died. Silence. Lady Bellamy broke it. Who, then? She asked, her voice ragged. Poirot met her gaze. I will tell you, he said. Tomorrow morning. In full. A protest broke out, Count Varisi rising, Ashcombe muttering under his breath. But Poirot raised a hand. "Tonight, you will remain here. I have already spoken to the authorities. No one will leave. No one will escape." He gave a small, solemn smile. "Because tomorrow, mes amis, the mask will fall." As the guests left the salon one by one, Poirot remained behind. He watched the rain slide down the windows. He watched their backs as they walked away. Some bowed their heads. One did not. And that was enough. The lie had cracked. Now it was time for it to collapse. Chapter 11. The Threads. Titan morning arrived with silver light and silence. The storm had passed, leaving behind a faint mist that clung to the canal and hung low over the rooftops of Venice like smoke after a quiet battle. From the upper balconies of Villa Moroni, the lagoon looked eerily still, as though waiting for a verdict. Inside, the atmosphere was leaden with anticipation. Breakfast had been laid as usual, silver pots of coffee, buttered brioche, soft fruits, glistening with sugar, but no one lingered over their plates. Conversation was clipped. Hands trembled slightly. Even the clinking of china against porcelain seemed too loud. They were waiting. By 9 o'clock, the butler received the call. Poirot requested the presence of all guests in the reading room, not the gold salon, not the grand dining hall, but the small, book-lined space tucked into the corner of the villa, a place for intimacy, not spectacle. They gathered with quiet reluctance. Lady Bellamy entered first, draped in navy with her eyes hidden behind round sunglasses, though there was no sun. Count Verisi followed, tense and sharply dressed, his cologne too strong. Lord Ashcombe looked older than he had days before, as if the past had reclaimed some part of him. Dr. Moretti sat stiffly, hands clasped, in her lap. Bellini lingered near the threshold like a man expecting to be dismissed. Lucia, pale but steady, took the last chair, folding her hands tightly in her lap. Poirot was already standing by the hearth, a leather folio under one arm and a single sheet of paper in the other. He did not speak at first. He allowed the silence to settle, uncomfortable, deliberate. Then, in a voice soft and sharp as a knife's edge, he began. "You have all been most patient, and for that, I thank you." His eyes swept the room. "We are now at the end of this affair, and before I speak plainly, I must walk you through it once more, not with speculation, but with precision." He paused. This was not a murder of passion, nor of impulse. It was a murder of calculation, one that required planning, not of the method, but of the moment. He lifted the folded sheet of paper. Signora Ravelli was not an easy woman. She inspired admiration, yes, but rarely love. She held power through charm and control. But in recent weeks, that control had begun to slip. She had grown fearful. She believed someone was threatening her, not overtly, but subtly. Poirot turned to Dr. Moretti. "She confided in you. She said she no longer felt in control, that someone was pulling strings, and you, madame, believed it was merely stress." Moretti opened her mouth, then closed it. Poirot nodded gently. She was not specific, because Helena Ravelli had always understood the importance of perception. To accuse someone without proof would have exposed her, so instead, she prepared a document, a transfer of inheritance. She wished to reward loyalty, not bloodline, not reputation. He turned to Lucia. She meant to sign it the morning after the masquerade. Lucia gave a single, slow nod. Poirot paced the room with careful steps. But that night, at the masquerade, Helena changed her mind. Or perhaps in the final hour, she simply chose delay. And that hesitation sealed her fate. He stopped at the edge of the circle. At 11:30 she left the ballroom. Several of you noticed she was distracted, tense. He turned to Verisi. "You danced with her. You said she was distant, but not afraid." "She was not," the Count replied, voice low. just angry. Oui, angry and prepared. She had something with her, something she did not trust, to leave lying around. The unsigned document. We know she placed it in the reading room, hidden beneath a folio. Perhaps she meant to retrieve it later. Perhaps she meant to destroy it. Poirot gestured around the room. But someone else followed. Watched. Waited. He crossed to the window, hands clasped behind his back. Now, let us consider the scene of the crime. Elena was found beneath the East Corridor sconce, a single wound just beneath the collarbone. No struggle, no noise. A precise strike. Medical. He glanced at Moretti, then away. But the blow was not immediately fatal. She bled. She tried to move. She staggered toward the ballroom. She was seen. And she collapsed. Poirot returned to the center of the room. There are two critical details here. First, the absence of a weapon. It was removed. Hidden. This was not panic. It was purpose. Second, Elena had removed her mask. Bellini saw her in the corridor holding it. She was no longer playing hostess. She was preparing to act. He held up the mask found in the costume trunk. But another mask, this mask, was found nearby, hidden, cracked. It belonged to Lady Bellamy, and it places her at the scene. But I do not believe she struck the blow. Francesca opened her mouth to protest, but Poirot raised a hand. You quarreled, yes. You confronted her, but your rage is verbal. Your injuries are social. You wanted to shame her, not kill her. Poirot turned. So the question becomes, who followed next? He opened the leather folio and removed a second sheet. It was a page from Elena's journal, the one Lucia had given him days before. He read aloud, There is more than one kind of mask. Some we're born wearing. He let the words linger. Then, he folded the page, set it on the table, and looked around the room. Elena Ravelli knew something about one of you. Something that was not a scandal, not a grudge, but a truth. A truth so dangerous, so fundamentally threatening, that its revelation would collapse the life that person had built. His voice softened. And I believe that person could not afford to let the curtain fall. No one moved. Poirot crossed to the fireplace, picked up a match and lit it with a whisper. The truth, mes amis, is not heavy. It is sharp, and once spoken, it cuts through everything. He dropped the match into the grate. I will not name the murderer now, not because I do not know, but because the final detail, the final choice, must come from them. He turned. If you are guilty, you already know this ends today. His voice dropped to a murmur. And if you are not, then you should fear nothing. He nodded once. I shall return here at noon, alone. If anyone wishes to speak with me before then, the door will be open. Poirot bowed, then stepped aside, and one by one, the guests filed out. Slower this time, more uncertain, because now the lie no longer belonged to them. It belonged to time. And time, as always, was running out. Chapter 12. The unmasking. At precisely noon, the reading room was still. The light from the tall arched windows had shifted, casting long patterns of gold across the faded rugs. A low breeze stirred the velvet curtains. The rain had passed, but the sky remained clouded, as if even Venice waited to exhale. Poirot sat in the high-backed chair by the hearth, the leather folio beside him, the cracked white velvet mask placed gently on the table before him. One by one, they came. Lucia entered first, her eyes rimmed with a quiet dread, her movements careful. She seated herself near the window. Dr. Moretti followed, hands folded tightly, her face composed, yet drawn. Then Lord Ashcombe, Count Verisi, Bellini, each quiet, solemn, their glances sharp. Finally, Lady Bellamy arrived, her hair pinned precisely, her expression unreadable behind carefully painted eyes. Poirot rose. "Mesdames et messieurs," he began softly, "I thank you." He did not pace, he did not pause, he simply looked at each of them in turn. "For what happened to Elena Ravelli," Poirot said, "we must understand not only what was done, but why. Because this was not only a murder, it was a reinvention." He turned to Lucia. "Elena Ravelli trusted you. She left you the list of names. She intended to sign the document. She wished to reward your loyalty." Poirot's voice softened. "But she also wished to punish a betrayal. Not of hers, but of identity." He turned to the others. In the final hours of her life, Elena was prepared to tell the truth. Not just about inheritance, not just about secrets, but about someone's past. A truth hidden in plain sight, behind social polish, impeccable manners, and just enough visibility to avoid suspicion. Poirot's gaze landed on the final guest, the one seated slightly apart, Dr. Sophia Moretti. She did not move, but her eyes fixed on him with the stillness of someone already halfway across a bridge. "They cannot return from." Poirot stepped forward. "Your name, madame, is not false. Your credentials are not false. But your past, your origin, that is the mask." The room was silent. Poirot opened the folio and removed a document. A certificate, found in Elena's private safe. She had retrieved it only days before her death. An old hospital record, Venice, 19 years ago. A maternity wing, he read aloud. "Child, male, mother, unknown, delivered under emergency supervision, discharged to foster care within 48 hours. He placed the document down. 2 years later, Elena Ravelli began supporting a private medical scholarship, quietly, anonymously, for one recipient. A gifted child, unnamed, records sealed. He turned to Dr. Moretti. You were that child, a foundling, raised with care, educated, protected. And Elena, your benefactor, your benefactress." Poirot's voice dropped. "She never claimed you as her own, but you were, in spirit, if not in name." Dr. Moretti was pale now, motionless. She saw in you a mirror of herself. But you never wished to be known as someone's shadow. You built your own name, your own discipline. And when Elena said she was going to reveal the truth, when she told you that she might make the relationship public, perhaps even claim you, you panicked. Poirot's words were slow now, measured, not because you hated her, but because she would take away what you had built. Everything you were, the poised, private, independent Dr. Sophia Moretti, would vanish. You would become someone else again, the child she rescued, the girl behind the curtain. He stepped closer. She confronted you in the corridor. Maybe gently, maybe fondly, but she said the wrong words. She said she would give you everything, and in doing so, take away your name. Poirot reached into the folio and removed a final object, a scalpel, wrapped in a silk cloth, found buried in the base of a ceramic vase in the east corridor. I believe this belonged to you, a tool of precision, of familiarity, and of quiet, immediate silence. He laid it on the table. You struck quickly, a single cut. You meant to stop her words. You didn't mean to kill. Poirot paused. But when she fell, when she began to bleed, you understood. There was no turning back. So you waited. You let someone else find her. You let the mask fall near the scene. You let Lady Bellamy's footsteps become your shield. He looked at her. Is it not so, madame? Dr. Moretti did not speak. Her hands remained in her lap. Then, slowly, she rose. The room watched, breathless. She turned to Poirot, her voice calm, eerily so. She told me she would take care of me, that I would always be safe. But what she meant was that I would always be hers. A pause. I was never hers. She looked at the others, not with apology, but with terrible, sorrowful clarity. I built myself from nothing. And she wanted to own that. A beat. I won't let anyone own me. Poirot bowed his head. I understand. The police were already waiting outside. Poirot had made the arrangements hours earlier. 2 uniformed officers entered silently. Dr. Moretti offered no resistance. As she passed Poirot, she paused. You're not as clever as they say, she murmured. You just know how to wait. Poirot smiled faintly. It is not the cleverness, madam. It is the symmetry. The villa was quiet once more. The guests departed over the following day, some in silence, others in whispers. Lady Bellamy sent a note to Poirot, unsigned with a single line. She was never the only one wearing a mask. Count Verisi left early, muttering about reputations and ruined seasons. Lord Ashcombe returned to England with no farewell. Lucia Morelli stayed one night longer. Poirot found her in the garden the morning after the arrest. She loved you, she said quietly. In her own way. I believe she loved many, Poirot replied. But she trusted few. Lucia turned toward him. And you? Poirot considered it. She trusted me to see the truth. Nothing more. Lucia nodded, and with that, she left. That evening, Poirot sat once more in the mirrored salon. The cracked mask rested beside him on a silver tray. He gazed at it, and then at his own reflection, one of many. It is always the same, he murmured. The mask falls, but beneath it, there is always another. The candle burned low, and outside, Venice exhaled.